Within death row, every interview with an inmate unfolds like a descent into the abyss of human darkness. The unsettling narratives of these condemned souls reveal haunting tales, providing a glimpse into their minds as they await their ultimate fate: death. Here are some disturbing interviews with death row inmates. Mark James Asai.
I never, ever in my life owned a gun until June 12, 1987. And 35 days later, I shot somebody with it.
July 18, 1987, Mark James shot and eventually killed 34-year-old Robert Lee Booker. The method used in the murder was brutal. However, it was just one of the two racially motivated murders he committed that led to his eventual demise. Born November 24, 1964 in Jacksonville, Florida, U.S., Asai was raised in a troubled environment, facing a lot of challenges in his upbringing. He never lived a normal life because his was marked by a series of criminal activities, including theft and assault. It's no wonder why then he encountered quite a number of legal issues, and the later events that occurred in his life removed the surprise as to why he would have affiliations with white supremacist groups. On July 17, 1987, Mark, his brother Robbie, and a friend Bubba embarked on a night of drinking and playing pool at various bars in Jacksonville, Florida. Now, this took a tragic turn when Asai, fueled by racial animosity, confronted Robert Lee Booker, a black man, ultimately shooting him in the stomach, causing him, Booker, to eventually succumb to internal hemorrhaging. As if this wasn't enough, on the same day as Mark and Bubba were looking for hookers, they encountered Robert McDowell, a mixed-race man dressed as a woman. And with the belief that McDowell owed him money due to a deal gone wrong, Asai shot McDowell 6 times as he tried to escape. Now, the worst part was, at that time, Asai callously justified the shooting, claiming that McDowell had cheated him. A medical examiner later confirmed that there were 3 gunshot wounds in the chest cavity, being the reason for McDowell's fatality. After following information provided by 2 acquaintances and the coverage of McDowell's murder on television crime segments, Mark Asai was apprehended and formally charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder. However, he was found guilty of both killings, and the jury recommended the death penalty, which the court believed to have adhered to, as it issued separate death sentences for each conviction. On November 18, 1988, Asai got the death penalty for the murders of both Booker and McDowell in a case that was prosecuted by Bernie de la Rionda, which was said to be his first death penalty-eligible trial at the time. Unfortunately for Asai, his death sentences were eventually upheld in 1991 and 2000, respectively. And after spending 3 decades in jail awaiting his execution, his life became a living hell. He told Tom Wills in the interview that he wants either freedom or death and not another day in prison, saying further that a stay of execution will only keep him locked up for a longer period. It was in this interview that he made the solemn confession of killing McDowell, as he said he had never had a gun in his life until June 12, 1987. And 35 days later, he would shoot someone with it. Even after that, he still maintained his innocence in the murder of Booker. On August 24, 2017, after a lengthy wait for his ultimate punishment, Mark James Asai was executed at Florida State Prison through a lethal injection. Michael Bruce Ross.
Well, I'm a serial killer. I've killed 8 women, 6 in this state and 2 in New York. I'm on death row for 4 of those women.
Not every convicted serial killer on death row can admit to being a serial killer and mention the crimes they have committed in totality, even mentioning the ones they were not convicted for. But Michael Ross had no problem saying it with no remorse whatsoever. Born on July 26, 1959, Ross was the oldest of 4 children, and his home was extremely dysfunctional. His mother abused him and his siblings, while some of his close friends say he was molested by his uncle. Nonetheless, Ross was a bright student. He graduated high school and was extremely antisocial. He attended Cornell in Ithaca, New York, where he would stalk women to their dorms. In his interview, he said he was sexually aroused by the thought of knowing they were scared of him, and in his sophomore year, he raped his first victim and eventually committed his first murder. Between 1981 and 1984, Ross killed 8 women of varying ages all across Connecticut and New York. He raped 7 out of 8 of his murder victims before killing them. Eventually, he was tied to a couple of these murders before confessing to all 8. He was convicted of 4 and sentenced to death on July 6, 1987 in Connecticut. He spent almost 18 years on death row before his execution. Something very disturbing in his interview was when he said,
For some reason with me, sexuality and violence have fused together.
And to further show how far gone his mind was, he said that each time he killed, he would make himself believe that he wasn't going to kill again, only for him to find his back against the wall of his murderous instincts. According to him, there was nothing the victims could have said or done to get themselves off the hook. As soon as he saw them, they were dead. The most disturbing part of that interview, though, was how well he described the way he murdered his victims. Especially the way he just had them face down and strangled them. Really gruesome. On May 13, 2005, Ross was executed by lethal injection at Osborne Correctional Institution in Somers, Connecticut. He was 45 years old, and despite his regrets in the final days of his life, Ross didn't request a special last meal before facing his execution, therefore having the good old prison food of the day. And also, when asked if he would like to make a last statement, he said without opening his eyes,
"No, thank you."
Good luck trying to figure that guy out. Scott Raymond Dozier.
How do you feel about the state using fentanyl to kill you?
I think it's awesome.
His words in that interview were as cold as the killings he orchestrated. But despite staring death in the face, he carved the path that led to his very own demise. Born November 20th, 1970 in Boulder City, Nevada, Scott here lived with his father, who worked for federal water projects throughout the American West, and his 2 siblings. He initially graduated from high school in 1989, and after finding nothing else to put his hands into, he enlisted into the Army the following year. On August 10, 1992, Scott was unfortunately discharged, and in a bid to live a responsible life, he got married to his high school sweetheart, Angela Drake, who eventually had a son for him, Ashton. Apparently his paradise didn't last for too long, as they would get divorced eventually, all before his mid-20s. In the process of trying to pave a new means of livelihood, Scott ventured into the underground world of drug trafficking, where he specifically got involved in production and sale of methamphetamine, during which he would alternate between Nevada and Arizona. But what he didn't know was that this wild roller coaster ride was going to catapult him into the weirdest downhill adventure of his life. April 18, 2002, at La Concha, a motel on the Las Vegas Strip, Scott met up with Jeremiah Miller for a drug deal for which Miller had brought $12,000 in cash. But Scott here got a little greedy because upon reaching that rendezvous point, Scott killed Miller, embered his body, and disposed of it in a suitcase near an apartment complex. It was by chance that the suitcase was found by a worker the following week. So on June 25, 2002, after a lot of investigation, Scott was eventually arrested in Phoenix, Arizona. They then found out he was connected to the murder of Jason Griffin Green. During his trial of that murder for Miller, Scott argued that there was a lack of physical evidence to connect him to that murder, but the prosecution was there to argue otherwise. In 2005, Dozier was given a 22-year sentence for killing Green, and upon his extradition to Nevada, he was convicted and given death for Miller's murder. Several attempts were made to expedite his execution, but for Scott here, it was like a long wait in hell. He told Vice News that the state of Nevada was just aiding him in delaying the inevitable, saying,
"You say you're gonna f***ing kill someone, you should f***ing kill him."
When he asked how he felt about the state using fentanyl to kill him, almost smirking, he said,
I think it's awesome.
How do you feel about the state using fentanyl to kill
I
you?
think it's awesome.
and even though you could see remorse when he talked about his child and possible grandchildren, his whole aura depicted that of one who couldn't wait to be executed. Well, I guess he couldn't wait any longer, because on January 5th, 2019, at 4:35 p.m., Scott was found dead as a result of self-inflicted harm which he carried out by hanging himself using a bedsheet attached to an air vent in his cell. Ted Bundy.
And without exception, every one of them was deeply involved in pornography, without question, without exception.
Ted Bundy had sat with Dr. James Dobson for his last interview, which we have to say was pretty disturbing. Born November 24th, 1946 in Burlington, Vermont, to Eleanor Louise Cowell, Ted Bundy was that guy who everyone found out was a rapist and a serial killer. First impressions would paint him as the epitome of an ideal man, the focal point of every woman's fantasy, a man who possessed charming looks coupled with a degree of psychology from the University of Washington. Who could have known that beneath all of this was a sinister and warped mind that ultimately led him down a destructive path? As the charmer that he was able to mask his murderous intent while abducting his victims. Using charm as the main strategy here, he would get away from law enforcement, the media, and the criminal justice system to maintain his self-acclaimed innocence. Now what he would do was meet up with victims in public, after which they would follow him to his car for some reason, and then he would restrain him and bring him to a motel or a secluded location for him to just sexually assault and kill him. In his sick nature, he would return to the bodies and engage in some more inappropriate acts with their corpses until the process of decomposition began. And if you want more, he would mutilate his victims, keeping their severed heads as souvenirs in his apartment. But these disturbing acts couldn't go on for too much longer. 1975, Bundy was apprehended and incarcerated in Utah on charges of aggravated kidnapping and attempted criminal assault. Subsequently, he became a suspect in an increasingly expanding list of unsolved homicides across several states. While facing murder charges in Colorado, Bundy pulled off 2 dramatic escapes and in the process committed many assaults in Florida, including 3 murders, after which he was eventually reapprehended in 1978. Nevertheless, Bundy faced 2 trials for the Florida homicides and gathered up 3 death sentences, something that wasn't too shocking. On January 23, 1989, Ted Bundy gave his last interview with Dr. Dobson, where he talked about the sinister effects of pornography mixed with a bit of violence on the minds of teenagers. Here he would describe his obsession with sexual material and alcohol that led him down the dark path he found himself. He would say that most of the men he met were motivated to commit violence like him, and were all deeply involved with pornography.
And without exception, every one of them was deeply involved in pornography, without question, without exception.
On January 24th, 1989, this guy's life came to an end as he sat in that Rayford electric chair. Richard Ramirez.
I didn't particularly care for people. I don't care about myself, really. I don't care about what happens to me. I never did, really.
Apart from his numerous murders, burglaries, and sexual assaults, if somehow you've never believed that Ramirez was a psychopath, well, the revelation made by him in this interview unveils the profound depths of his psychopathic nature, which tragically transformed the course of his life forever. Born February 29, 1960 in El Paso, Texas, US of A, to Julian Tapia Ramirez and Mercedes Munoz Ramirez. Richard was one described as a made psychopath due to his troubled childhood, which was said to be heavily influenced by crime. Now, being frequently abused by his father, he'd get pushed into developing disturbing and gruesome fascinations during his early and mid-teens. He was then influenced by an older cousin who taught him some military skills that he would later use during his killing spree. And to put the cherry on the cake, he was a Satanist. By the time Richard had left his home in Texas and moved on to California at the age of 22, he began his frequent use of cocaine, which would become like another wave of tempest in his life. This would lead him to commit burglaries frequently, accompanied by murders, attempted murders, rapes, attempted rapes, and battery to support his drug addiction. And as time went on, Ramirez unleashed a gruesome murder spree that terrorized the residents of greater Los Angeles, and later the San Francisco Bay Area over the course of 14 months. In April 1984, he executed what was perceived to be his first known murder, although this crime wasn't initially connected to Ramirez, nor was it known to be his doing. It wasn't until 2009 that it became crystal clear. His tools were a wide variety of weapons, including handguns and various types of knives, a tire iron, and a claw hammer. He punched, pistol whipped, and strangled a lot of his victims. One time he stomped on one of his victims in her sleep and tortured another by shocking her with a live electrical cord. Ramirez was sick, and he enjoyed degrading and humiliating his victims, especially those who survived his attacks, or those whom he explicitly decided not to kill. Back in '89, Ramirez was convicted of 13 counts of murder, 5 for attempted murder, and 11 for sexual assault, with 14 on burglary, among other charges, even through the course of his trial. And through the course of this whole thing, he never showed any remorse. In 1993, he told Inside Edition in that interview that he didn't particularly care for people, most especially his victims. And when asked about himself, as he was already on death row, he said that he never cared about himself either, or what was going to happen to him. Well, just like the judge who upheld his 19 death sentences said in this interview, coupled with his deeds, exhibited cruelty, callousness, and viciousness beyond any human understanding. On June 7, 2013, after being on California's death row and awaiting execution for 23 years, Ramirez died at the age of 53 due to complications arising from B-cell lymphoma while receiving medical care at a hospital in California, bringing an end to this psychopathic serial killer. John Wayne Gacy.
Vengeance is mine, saith the Lord, because you will have executed somebody that didn't commit the crime.
That was John Gacy, aka the Clown Killer, claiming to be innocent in this interview with Walter Jacobson. However, what makes that interview unnerving and disturbing is the fact that 13 years before that, he already confessed to the cops that he actually committed these murders. Born March 17, 1942 in Chicago, Illinois, John Gacy was a businessman during the day, but operated as a chilling serial killer at night. In 1967, he sexually assaulted Donald Voorhees in his house and received a 10-year prison sentence. However, this guy was released on parole after serving only 18 months. Some say it was because of his political connections, while others attribute it to some kind of luck. But regardless of his early release, John Gacy didn't really cease his murderous activities. In fact, it propelled him to escalate these actions to a more sinister level. He began luring boys under the guise of offering construction work inside his apartment. Once inside, he subjected them to sexual abuse, torture, and would ultimately strangle them to death. Some of the bodies were buried in his basement, while others were thrown into a river. Despite numerous cases of boys disappearing all over the place, suspicions never fell on John for many years, because he was that well-respected businessman who also worked as a clown for children's parties. Nevertheless, in 1978, the consequences of his crimes finally caught up with him when he was arrested for the murder of Robert Peist, a resident in his neighborhood. During the course of that investigation, the forensic team identified body parts from over 10 different boys buried in his basement. This guy tried to dispute the technical details of how he murdered his victims. But despite his efforts, Mr. John Gacy was ultimately found guilty and sentenced to death in March 1980. So like we said before, he confessed and told the police how he murdered his victims. Then it just got to you when you saw him deny ever knowing any of them in his interview with Walter Jacobson. He cemented on the fact that he was telling the truth of his innocence, and backed that up by saying he took 3.5 hours worth of truth serum. Well, in the words of Walter Jacobson,
he was rambling and often inconsistent, but always very cagey.
On May 10, 1994, after being placed on death row for 14 years, John Wayne Gacy was finally executed with lethal injection. Velma Margie Barfield.
The last 10 years was just like that. Years of a drug nightmare.
Drugs, she said, led her to 10 years of drug nightmares, which eventually led to her state of not knowing what she was doing or where she was. According to her interview, it was these drugs that created the pathway to her incarceration. Born October 29, 1932 in Eastover, North Carolina, Velma Barfield was raised near Fayetteville. Now, a physically abusive father with an unsupportive mother would drive her into marrying Thomas Burke in 1949, with whom she had 2 children. They were happy until she had a hysterectomy and developed back pain. It was at that point that a behavioral change set in for Barfield, coupled with the excessive use of drugs that later would turn into addiction. In 1969, Velma's relationship with her partner Burke became strained due to alcohol abuse, which would escalate into these heated arguments. On April 4th, the same year, after Burke seemingly passed out, Barfield left with the children, only for her to return and find their house burned to ashes, leaving Burke dead. She then went on to marry Jenkins Barfield in 1970, and he kinda died from heart complications in less than a year. Now, in 1975, Barfield got into some trouble bouncing checks. She was given 6 months in prison, after which she served only 3. So in 1976, she transitioned to caretaking. And while working for the Edwards couple, tragedy struck sooner than later, leading to their deaths. It was later revealed, though, that Barfield confessed to Dolly Edwards' murder. In 1977, she would care for Record Lee, who had broken her leg. Her husband, John Henry, who began experiencing these racking pains in his stomach and chest, along with vomiting and diarrhea, soon after she came into their lives, died. And Barfield, being a magnet to murder, confessed to that one as well. Another victim of hers would be Roland Stewart Taylor, Barfield's then boyfriend and a relative of Dolly Edwards. This led to her arrest in 1978, and even though she denied the murder of Jenkins Barfield, she confessed to killing Lillian Bullard, Dolly Edwards, and John Henry Lee. But she was only tried and convicted for the murder of Roland Stewart Taylor. She would go on to talk about how drugs altered the trajectory of her life in an interview, but her attorney wouldn't allow her to say whether she knew what she was doing when she committed her crimes. Here she said that she had found God within the 4 walls of incarceration, and it was her relationship with God that enabled her to survive her period of incarceration up until that moment. She later apologized for the pain she had caused several people through her mindless killings, an apology that several people have refused to take seriously.
I'm sorry for the hurt that I've caused so many people.
On November 2nd, 1984, Velma Barfield was executed at Central Prison and was buried in a small, rural North Carolina cemetery near her first husband, Thomas Burke. Carrie Lynn Dalton.
I've committed armed robberies, I've committed burglaries. I'm by no means some angel, poor innocent, picked up out of society. My life took me here.
Many would see this death row inmate's interview with Joan London and not feel good. As she talked about her life of crime, she bitterly wept, showing another side to the once dangerous Carrie Lynn Dalton. Born January 24th, 1959 in Van Nuys, California, Carrie's childhood was far from perfection. She had this alcoholic father who left her and her siblings in the care of her mother. Her struggles as a child would push her life into drug abuse, which she took on for years to come. Despite the rough terrain of her upbringing, Carrie was able to find love, get married, and eventually have 5 children. But it looked like Carrie was never destined for a happy ending, because just like her father, her husband left and eventually got locked up, leaving Carrie alone to cater for their children. It was no surprise that Carrie's use of drugs was still imminent, as the pressure of taking care of all those kids would get to her. It was at this point that she met, befriended, and lived with 23-year-old Irene Melanie May, who also loved the drugs. She would then get into that drug circle and meet people like Mark Lee Tompkins, Cheryl Ann Baker, and this other guy known only as George. How could she have possibly known that being friends with these people would jeopardize her life forever? June 26, 1988, Carrie accused Irene of theft, sparking a huge argument between them. Now, this caused the neighbors to call the police, as that altercation caused a lot of noise in the neighborhood. So when the sheriff's deputy arrived, he reported no evidence of a burglary or any criminal activity other than the resident, Joanne Fedor, being high on methamphetamine. He searched in and out of the residence and didn't see any physical traces or bloodshed, and noted in his report that the resident was a 5150, police code for mentally incapable of comprehending reality. With caution, Mark, George, Cheryl, and Carrie left Joanne's home, while Irene was never seen or heard from again. Irene's family and police looked for a long time, and it was later discovered through various witnesses that the trio killed Irene as payback for stealing from Carrie. They also found out they subjected her to electric shocks, smashed her knee, and finished her off by injecting her with a syringe filled with battery acid. On May 14, 1992, Carrie, Dalton, and her friends were arrested for torturing and murdering poor Irene, and she was eventually sentenced to death. In the interview, she told London that even though she pretty much wasted her life, she didn't deserve to be on death row, because she didn't commit the crime as it was said. Her emotional wall began to crumble as she expressed regret for the life she lived, saying she'd committed armed robberies and burglaries and done things she wasn't proud of that led her to this point. Now, some people might find it hard to believe that the once notorious Carrie could break down in tears and just claim innocence for the murder of Irene. But ever since her sentencing, she's been incarcerated at the Central California Women's Facility in Chowchilla, California, awaiting her execution and trying to appeal. Carol Edward Cole.
Do you deserve to die? I can't answer that question. Well, it's the ultimate question. It is the question. For what I did, yes, I think I deserve to die.
While talking about his life in prison, his regrets, making his apology, and his death sentence, what was crazy here was his calmness, despite staring death in the face, unlike some others. Born May 9, 1938, in Sioux City, Iowa, Cole lived with his parents and his younger sister. Now, we'd like to say he had a normal childhood, but you know it's not true. His journey to being a mass murderer began in his early years. Following his father's departure from that house for World War II, Cole's mother engaged in numerous relationships with various men. At that point, the family had moved to California, where her striking beauty drew the attention of affluent individuals, specifically the rich and bossy in the Golden State. And as life went on, Cole would be abused by his mother, who not only threatened to harm him if he told his father about any of these other guys, but also subjected him to humiliation by dressing him as a girl for school, an act known to attract ridicule and bullying from peers. Now, obviously, these actions deeply affected Cole, and one day he vented his anger on a fellow classmate named Dwayne by drowning him in a lake. Now, the authorities deemed Dwayne's death an accident, which gave birth to Carol Cole's sinister tendencies. From 1960 to 1963, Cole was repeatedly admitted to various mental hospitals. Now, during this period, a doctor in one of those hospitals observed a distinctive aspect of Cole's behavior, specifically his interactions with women. And let's say this doctor made a critical evaluation of Cole's behavior. Half of his murders were women, and it seemed like he had a diabolical fantasy of killing them before making love. Possibly he was influenced by his tumultuous upbringing, maybe from the punishment he was getting from his mom, but the exact cause remains uncertain. However, a few months later, Cole relocated to Texas, where he met and eventually married Billy Whitworth, an alcoholic sex worker. Now, at this point, he was already a killer, but his marriage to this woman would push him into a void of no return. His killing instincts, especially against women, led him to killing the one victim he regretted killing till the day he died, the girl whom he mentioned in his interview.
Especially the one that was the 11-year-old girl way back in 1967.
5 years of incarceration for her death was like stepping on a tiger's tail, because by the time he came out, he had become a living demon. Within 9 years, he murdered 14 women, with the most agonizing one being the murder of Mary Cushman in 1979. Well, nothing lasts forever, as his acts finally caught up with him, bringing about his arrest after being linked to the murder of 3 women in Texas. On April 9, 1981, Cole was convicted of the 3 murders. He was given life at Huntsville Prison. Fortunately or unfortunately for him, his mother died in 1984, which made him agree to a fresh murder charge in Nevada. It was upon his extradition to the state of Nevada that he was sentenced to death in 1984. Now, during his prison interview, they let him smoke a cigar. Maybe that was the calmness he was showing during his interview. He talked about how he regretted what he did, and even though he was a bit hesitant, he said that he truly deserved the death penalty. On December 6, 1985, his end would finally come, executed by lethal injection at Nevada State Prison. Nico Allen Jenkins.
And all I have to prove is that my doctors, Natalie Baker and Martin Wetzel, 2 psychiatrists, diagnosed me with schizoaffective bipolar type before I was released.
This was a mind-blowing interview, a testament to the unchecked mental health of one of the scariest serial killers alive. Born September 16, 1986, in Colorado, to David A. McGee and Lori Jenkins, Nico here's known as a product of a troubled childhood. He went through a lot of traumatic events, including hospitalization at the young age of 8. And throughout his childhood, he would cycle in and out of the juvie system, as well as state care and mental health facilities. The living conditions he was subjected to caused him to suffer from these nightmares and a lot of anxiety, which eventually led him to be placed in foster care until he turned 18. August 2013, Nico embarked on this violent killing spree shortly after his release. His first victims, Juan Uribe Peña and Jorge Cajiga Ruiz, were discovered on August 11th in a parked truck with gunshot wounds to the head, having been lured for a supposed encounter. Less than 2 weeks later, Curtis Bradford was found dead with 2 shots to the back. It'd be a Facebook photo that would connect his murder with Jenkins, which would be the only murder he was connected to. Andrea Kruger, Jenkins' final victim, was discovered on August 21st with a lot of shots from a 12-gauge shotgun. Surveillance would show her last moments leaving work before her death at the hands of Jenkins. On August 30th, 2013, Jenkins was arrested for unrelated charges. He faced a lot of evidence against him, part of which was surveillance that showed him buying the distinctive ammunition used in the killings, coupled with additional camera footage tracing the route to Kruger's abandoned SUV. Now, a few months later, Jenkins would confess to all 4 murders during a rambling 8-hour interview, attributing them to a sacrificial act for the deity Apophis in ancient Egyptian religion. Following the confession, he was charged with 4 counts of murder. In November 2013, Nico Jenkins wanted to plead guilty to the 4 slayings, vowing to protect Apophis's kingdom with savage brutality in handwritten letters. On April 16, 2014, he was found guilty of those murders, and 3 years later, Jenkins received the death sentence, coupled with 450 years for weapons charges. In his interview, he took you on his traumatic journey from the beginning to the end. And for him, the most painful part was no one believing in the voices in his head, even after he reported it. Even though we now know him as this serial killer with an unhealthy past and a frightening malicious grin, his interview showed a softer side to him as opposed to this crazy, inhumane one. Well, who are we to say? On April 20th, 2020, unfortunately for Jenkins, the U.S. Supreme Court refused to hear his appeal, but he's currently incarcerated at the Nebraska Correctional Facility, awaiting the death penalty.